All right, well, good afternoon. I'm here with John Baer of Penn Live, and he's going to talk about some of the big changes in the state, or some of the things that he probably wishes would change, but probably won't. So, John, again, thank you for this interview. And I'm curious as to see, where do you think the state's political demography, geography is going to play out over the next 5 or 10 years, in terms of like how the Republican Party is changing. They're flipping a bunch of the control of county government in Western PA that have been Democratic since the New Deal, and likewise Democrats are flipping control over county governments that have been Republican since there's a Republican Party. So those are fairly dramatic changes, and you're better situated to see how do you think that plays out over the near to medium term.
Yeah, it's interesting, John, and thanks for having me, and hello to all your students. Pennsylvania has always been a largely rural state. It still is. I think a vast majority of the 67 counties are designated as rural. And so there's a built-in conservatism, even given the demographic changes that you mentioned, and there are some demographic changes. The interesting thing politically is that shift, particularly in the West and the Southwestern counties, really began in the 80s, and it has just kind of evolved and grown since then. So-called Reagan Democrats, that hardworking steel mill workers, coal miners, just kind of moved a little bit to the right. They had always been union people. They had always been pro-Democrat, as you know. And at the same time, the suburbs of Philadelphia began to get a little bit red. I mean, there was a lot of money in that area. And so there was that little bit of shift. And now those suburbs, the collar counties around Philadelphia, have kind of reverted back. They're now pretty blue, although there's some Republican presence down there, but they're not hardcore Democrat. They're not the city of Philadelphia, where the Democratic registration edge is like 6-1, and it's extremely liberal. So you have, in many ways, not unlike America, you have kind of blue edges in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh remains Democratic, and Philadelphia, and then this vast central area, the so-called flyover states, and in this case, the flyover counties, that remain pretty solidly Republican. And so the changes are there, but they're not large enough to change the basic makeup of the state. It is still a purple state, and I think increasingly so. Democrats, especially Democrats coming out of Philadelphia, just really don't have a good concept of how to win statewide. But because of population, you can win a statewide election in Pennsylvania by carrying 10 of the 67 counties, which tells you that if you're a Democratic candidate, you don't have to worry about everybody else. And that creates a problem, not in campaigning and not in politics, but in governance. Because once you get in there, you have to govern for the entire state. And so what happens is we get people from those kind of areas elected to high office, US Senate, governor, and then once they're in power, they have to find a way to connect with not only their constituency to stay connected, but with the vast middle that is not their constituency. And so we're famous for gridlock in Harrisburg, compete with Washington. We're like a mini Washington when it comes to getting legislation out of Harrisburg. And that's part of the reason. It's such a diverse state, 6 major media markets, literally different cultures in the state. And that makes it very tough to govern.
So I'm going to switch up my questions that we talked about earlier. Is what I mean, some of the big changes that I see happening in the state, in terms of politics and governance, is that the decline of newspapers, which is really rapid. It's not like Pennsylvania ever had great political coverage of Harrisburg, but I think that's gotten worse from my impression. I think voters, certainly like in the US, a lot of voters are getting their information from basically Facebook and online sources, which is sometimes just not even loosely based on reality. It's not even based in reality. It's sort of antithetical to reality.
Yeah.
So I guess it's sort of a chicken and the egg question. Is Pennsylvania, are the okay, so I guess one question is how, what will happen with the political culture of the state, but also what would it take to improve things? Is it possible to have politicians that kind of create a more, to really kind of change the temperature or change the culture of the state? Do you see any evidence that voters themselves are demanding higher standards out of Harrisburg?
I thought that would happen after 2016 because people started paying much more attention to governance and to politics, but I haven't seen any evidence that it's happening. But let me go back to your newspaper and coverage question. I have some genetic experience there. My father was a Capitol reporter before me. He worked for the Harrisburg Patriot News, which is where I started my career. And so we lived within walking distance of the Capitol. I spent Sunday mornings as an 8, 9, 10-year-old in the Capitol newsroom. At that time, there were maybe 50, 55 journalists assigned to that newsroom, which is right in the middle of the Capitol, very conveniently located between the House and the Senate. And many, many years later, when I worked for the Philadelphia Daily News and the Philadelphia Inquirer, I joined that Capitol newsroom. And by the time I got there, there were still maybe 30, 35. Today, if you walk into that newsroom on any given workday, you might find 2 to 5 people there because, well, for 2 reasons. Nobody wants to cover state government in a big state unless the capital is located in the state's biggest city. Nobody in Philadelphia cares about state government. That's a very mayoral-centric media market. I mean, the mayor, city council get covered like crazy. There's actually more coverage of the state in Pittsburgh than there is in Philadelphia, even though that's the population center. So people who get assigned to the Capitol from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, they don't really want to be there. They miss the big city. And so they tend to be there for very short periods, for a couple of years. And very often, it's a great place to get very good clips, to get very good stories of impact, to get great personalities to cover. But a lot of good journalists want to move up, and they will do that. They'll go to larger papers in other states and move on. So there's not a lot of consistency in the coverage. There's not a lot of, historical intuition and guidance and analysis. And so the coverage tends to lack. The Associated Press used to have 5 reporters and a photographer in that newsroom. Today they have 2 reporters. And that's true across the country in capitals that aren't located in the state's largest city. So that's been a drawback. And as you know, I mean, the entire print world is on life support, and who knows how long it'll be around. So, and that's a problem. I mean, the best democracy is an informed democracy. And if a state constituency isn't informed, they're not going to be interested in state elections. So we historically have turnout rates, even in general elections, that tend to be lower than the national average. Bad for the state, bad for democracy, bad for the people who pay taxes here. And then, I'm sorry, the rest of that question had to do with,
well, do you think it's
what could change it?
Right. What do you think? There's a politician that could come in, or do you think it's going to be that there's like you? I would have thought there would have been a more informed citizenry, and that would change things. And who knows? Maybe it will. But like you said, I haven't seen tons of evidence of that. There are some. I mean, there's a little bit better coverage, I think, maybe by WITF and the radio, but I mean, it's not like it's a huge, I I mean, in some ways, I had heard this from another politician who was talking, I'm sorry, another journalist who was talking about political coverage, and they said, who's your competitor? And they were talking to the guy who used to be editor of Vox, and they said, who's your chief competitor? And he said, everything.
Yeah,
and he said, it's not other political news. He goes, nobody has to read political news,
that's right.
and almost nobody wants to. And then that kind of tends to drive the wackier or the more extreme coverage gets rewarded, because you have people go to something because it's intense, and then you're rewarded as a website or as a news outlet if you basically can generate an intense following rather than a very broad following. So the business model of, the old newspapers that used to try not to alienate anybody because they were selling ads for Ford dealerships and all the rest,
Right.
that model is completely out the window, and we're now back to, tracking ads and, internet.
I mean, there is some good news, John, and that is what's evolved in journalism here and everywhere else are these composites of news entities that have joined under one umbrella and share work. And so you have in Pennsylvania, you have Spotlight, which was headlined by the Inquirer, but that includes all the major papers, including the Harrisburg paper. WITF, I believe, is part of that pattern. If they're not, they're in some other pattern, and they have been doing very good work. There's a news outlet called Capital Star that works out of Harrisburg. They cover solely state government, and they do a very good job. The problem is those are largely online facilities. So unless you have an interest in, the likelihood that you even see them is minimal. There is good coverage out there. It's just not landing on people's doorsteps like it used to. You have to look for it. You have to find it. And as you suggest, social media kind of blocks all that out. You see something on Facebook, you see something on Twitter that draws you to it. And it's not necessarily going to be an informative analysis of legislation or policy. And that makes it tough. On the question of could a politician change it? Two politicians that I covered during their gubernatorial campaigns, Ed Rendell, who the former mayor of Philadelphia, was convinced. He would tell me, look, I've dealt with Philadelphia City Council, the worst deliberative body on the planet, and I was able to get some things done in Philadelphia. And I would tell him, Ed, it's not the same. In Philadelphia, as in any city, first of all, you're all Democrats down there. Everybody has the same agenda. Everybody wants less crime, lower taxes, wants their streets plowed. Everybody wants the same thing in a city. You get in a state like Pennsylvania, not everybody wants the same thing. Roads and bridges are a lot more important in western and rural areas than they are in suburban and wealthy areas. The different people have different agendas. There's not a lot of issues that you can find consensus on. Plus, you've never really dealt with real Republicans. Real Republicans are different than Republicans like Arlen Specter or Thatcher Longstreth that grew up in Philadelphia. And the same with Tom Wolfe. Businessman, very successful, very wealthy. He said, look, I've dealt with business people all my life. I know how to make things happen. I know how to get things done. I'm going to do the same thing as governor. And I said, wait and see, because not everybody is going to want the same things that you want. And so he's been stymied at just about every major policy issue. And so we have this gridlock. And I mean, it's very important to understand that it isn't that it's villainy. It's just that people in a state with this many rural constituents are going to have a problem trying to get things that apply to everybody. And the political system knows and understands that and is most interested in its own survival. And so our political system, you know, the old saying that people who are elected to office first and foremost want to stay in office. And so to do that, you have to make sure we stay on an even keel, nothing gets rattled, there's no reason to hate us. And so we get reelected time and time again. The reelection rates for Pennsylvania lawmakers is above 90% every single cycle. And this is in a state that I would argue is the least progressive state in the Northeast, and has been for a long, long time. What are the things that could change that? Well, they would include, for instance, campaign finance reform. We're the Wild West, unlike most other states. There's no limits on what you can give, take, or spend on your campaign in Pennsylvania. There are limits on congressional races, federal races, but not on statewide races, not for governor, not for lieutenant governor, not for the legislature. We have the largest legislature full-time. There's only 4 full-time legislatures in America. There's no reason to have a full-time legislature. We have the largest one in the nation. We're the 5th or 6th largest state. It makes no sense. So shrinking the size of the legislature would make it more efficient and less costly. Merit selection of judges. We're one of a handful of states that elect judges at every single level. Merit selection would be no election of judges on a statewide level. Nobody knows who they are when they run in a campaign. And the only people spending money on their campaign are law firms, unions, and big business, because they're the same people that are going to be in front of those statewide judges on statewide issues are the same people that put them there. In 2015, Pennsylvania broke the all-time national record for campaign spending to elect judges. Millions and millions, something like $16 million to elect 3 new judges, all Democratic. And so we have a Democratic-controlled state Supreme Court that goes up against a Republican-controlled legislature, and all they do is bang heads on a regular basis. Just the appearance of somebody selling justice, which a lot of advocates of merit selection say, just the appearance gets people to lose confidence in decisions made by courts that are packed with people who were elected. Redistricting. We really don't have a public commission to redistrict. Every state that does has fairer maps, both congressional and legislative. Recall elections, we don't have that. Somebody commits a crime, somebody is so bad that we want them out of there, that there's a consensus. We don't have that. Other states have that. Initiative and referendum. Citizens in Pennsylvania cannot bring up issues that the legislature ought to deal with, should deal with, or use the Constitution to change. We give automatic raises to our lawmakers every year because they're the ones that wrote the law that says we should get automatic raises every year, no matter the performance. All you got to do is be there and you get an automatic raise. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it goes, we have late budgets. There ought to be penalties for late budgets. You can't get a budget on time, you don't get paid. Other states have that, we don't have that. We're the only state in the mid-Atlantic and the only state in the Northeast, except for New Hampshire, that hasn't raised the minimum wage in a decade.
Right.
We're a worker state, we're a blue-collar state, we're an agricultural state. People can't live on $7.25 an hour. We won't raise the minimum wage. And probably the most important element to increase voter registration, and voter registration advocates will tell you this, is same-day registration. We don't have that. Other states have that, where you can go in, register, and vote on the same day. So the list goes on and on and on of things that could be done and should be done, but that would change things. That would allow competition. Open primary. We don't have open primaries. Lots of states have open primaries. We have over 1 million voters who are registered either independent, as I am, or third party. Cannot vote in a primary. And in a state like Pennsylvania, because of the way the districts are drawn, that's really the only chance you have to change an incumbent, is in a primary. We don't have that option. An open primary, most importantly, would require candidates to not use the extremes of their party's ideology. When you run in a Republican primary in Pennsylvania, you better be pretty far to the right, because that's where that base is. Same for a Democrat, you better be pretty far to the left. So all that does is secure the gridlock. If we had open primaries and anybody could vote for anybody, candidates would have to appeal to a broader base than just their party's ideology. And I think that would improve things.
Right. of all the things you listed, and that's a very comprehensive list. And like you said, I'm sure it's not exhaustive, but it's a very good list. The only thing that at least that I'm aware of, and I'm more of an economic historian than a business and then a political one, but is I mean, the League of Women Voters did seem to have had some success at the federal level of getting the maps changed. And I think that put some pressure that in this round of redistricting, that it seemed less extremely gerrymandered, although we're not out of the woods yet. So there's still some room.
Well, actually, John, the reason it would be less this time is that same Democratic controlled Supreme Court is in place.
Correct.
Redistricting in Pennsylvania always ends up in the court because the governor, whoever he or she is, well, not she, we don't elect women statewide. The governor, whoever he is, fights with the legislature. They can't settle it. It goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ends up. That's what happened the last time. That's why we now have 9 and 9 on the congressional level, 9 Republicans, 9 Democrats. We're going to lose 1 seat this year. Legislature knows, Republican leaders know they can't go too far in gerrymandering because the court will overturn it, as they did in 2018.
Right. So a couple of other questions. I don't want to keep you too long, although I'd keep you here all day if I could. One of the I'm kind of curious as to the state does have an extremely strong rural basis, but the rural areas are declining pretty strongly in demographic terms. And I haven't seen much. I mean, and so the whole, I guess I was interested in how do you think, well, I mean, and one, that COVID will accelerate that because it seems like that's become it's become a partisan issue. So people on a basis of tribal loyalty aren't protecting themselves against a pandemic with the consequences that carries. So I guess I'm just curious as to what, either in terms of the demographics or the, or just the politics of it. What lasting effects do you think the pandemic is going to have on Pennsylvania?
Well, it's really interesting. There's people have noted that in the northeastern counties, there have been a lot of real estate changes from people moving from New York or buying a second home in those rural counties. And the presumption is if you're moving out of New York, or you're moving out of Philadelphia, or you're moving out of Trenton, you're probably a Democrat. So there's a suggestion that some of those northeastern counties, traditionally solid Republican, might be a little less so Republican. And you're right that the rural population is in decline. The counterbalance to that, John, is the rural population in Pennsylvania is voting at levels it never did before. And the former president is the cause or the blame, whichever you like, for that. Donald Trump in 2016 brought out rural numbers like no one had ever seen in the state. If that stays in place, then there's not going to be a lot of change at the polls. Demographics might change, but the outcomes might not. We just don't know yet how much of a force Trump will be, not only in 2022, but in 2024, the next presidential.
Right. No, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. I mean, it's, and so 2 more questions. And so do you think that I wanted to ask about the GOP's focus on election integrity, or this kind of, or alternatively, the big lie, and that shows no sign of really playing out or kind of dampening down. So how does that play out over the next 5 or 10 years? Does it just sort of fade into the background and become just another issue of something to kind of get voters, primary voters riled up, or what?
Well, it can go one of 2 ways. First of all, it's dangerous in the sense that it could discourage people from voting. If people think elections are rigged, a lot of people will say, why should I vote? A lot of people say, why should I vote now? We don't need any more factors to pile onto that. I think the thing that we're going through, the thing that Wisconsin is going through, the thing that Arizona went through about stop the steal, do recounts, do audits, I think that will fade, but not anytime soon. I mean, you said 5 years. I think maybe 3 or 4, again, depending on what happens in 2024. If Donald Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party, it's never going away in our lifetimes. But for now, it is simply a paean to Trump. And Republicans, you watch, Republicans who will run for governor this year, will run for Senate this year, won't deny it. I mean, they won't say, look, it's not true. The election was legit, but they won't. They might not embrace it with the same fervency that Donald Trump does, but it'll still be on the plate, it'll still be on the banquet choice for people who believe it. And trust me, Pennsylvanians in rural counties, the Republican base, believe it. Franklin and Marshall does some excellent polling. As you know, Franklin and Marshall College poll, they show something like 70% of Republicans still favor Trump. And there was a poll this week. I forget if it was Quinnipiac. Wall Street Journal reports that a new Quinnipiac poll shows that 59% of Republicans have changed their view on how the perpetrators of January 6th should be punished. So that whole shifting thing, I mean, Democrats, like 93% of Democrats believe January 6th was an attack on democracy. 59%, 29% of Republicans don't. So as long as we have that big a rift, the election thing, the election steal, stop the steal, that's still going to be in play politically. And it's too bad. I mean, every court but one that across America, 60, 70 courts, a lot of them Trump appointees as judges, found nothing, or certainly not enough. Look, no election is perfect. Is there fraud? Sure. There's some fraud in every election, minuscule amount, not enough to change the outcome. Wouldn't change anything, wouldn't change the Electoral College, wouldn't change the Pennsylvania numbers, but it's still out there, it's consistent, and a lot of people believe it.
Yeah, no, that's a very dangerous road we're on. I think I saw somebody who said, well, you know, will it lead to a civil war? Oh, come on, don't be serious. Just a sort of version of the Troubles in Ireland.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, well, that's okay. So just decades of assassination, you know. But I have been sort of impressed that I keep waiting. I keep waiting for politicians to be shot, and I don't think that that's that's off the agenda. I'm not talking Pennsylvania, but just it's a little surprising that as much fervor as there is, that somebody just hasn't taken it upon, and there have been, but I mean, but I'm talking not by people who are mentally ill, but by people who are just politically committed.
Right.
So on a kind of, to go out on a cheerier note, so who, if you had to pick either your most favorite or your least favorite politicians statewide, who would they be?
Well, I mean, as a journalist, the two politicians that I most loved covering, traveling with, campaigning with, were Ed Rendell and Arlen Specter. Ed Rendell, a Democrat, Arlen, a Republican of sorts, because I mean, they were, first of all, both of them had a great sense of humor. Rendell was a terrific prankster, and Arlen's sense of humor was so dry that it would just, you know, crack up anybody that was with him. Plus, they were the hardest working on the ground politicians that I personally have covered in my life. No stone unturned. Absolutely dedicated to shaking hands and talking to people, and loved the game, loved policy. They were both very smart guys, and very much impressed with people who understood policy and wanted policy. Traveling a bus with Rendell or traveling on a campaign with Arlen was just an awful lot of fun for any journalist, and I think any journalist who did that would tell you the same thing. Um, there are loathsome people in politics and in elective office, and in our state, well, the way to sum it up is, after the book that I wrote almost a decade ago came out, a friend of mine said, "Do you know the two most recurrent phrases in your book?" And I said, "No." And the publisher didn't catch this either. But the two most recurrent phrases were, "I am not making this up," and "he also went to prison."
Right.
Which
I
kind of sums up Pennsylvania politics, right? I
correct.
mean, you get such goofy things that in Pennsylvania politics, and so many of them end up in prison,
Right.
that sort of summed it up.
There's the Wikipedia entry on Pennsylvania politicians in jail doesn't have a list. It has a list by decade,
Yeah,
which tells you how many of them there are. And it's just for every possible thing under the sun. I mean, it's just, I mean,
it's
there's,
extraordinary.
yeah, I mean, there's a story, I don't know whether it's true, from the 19th century that somebody was visiting a family friend in Connecticut, and they were all having a great time. And then the person mentioned that they were a Pennsylvania state senator, and the host started hiding all the valuables.
That's great. We have a record. I can't believe there's another state in the nation that could claim this, John, but we had at one time two former speakers, a Democrat and a Republican, who had been convicted. This would have been John Purcell from Philadelphia and Bill DeWeese from Greene County out west. They were both sentenced to prison. And outside of Harrisburg is a state prison, Camp Hill Institution, which is a clearinghouse that you go there first before you get sent to your final prison destination. They shared a cell. There cannot be another state where two former speakers of either party were in the same prison cell, even if it was for a day or two.
But I thought you were going to go with they shared a cell and then they started a lobbying firm as soon as they got out, because that would be the.
Actually, both of them have done some lobbying. Now that you mentioned it, they're both out and both working.
Right.
So,
well, thank you so much for your time, and thanks so much for your book and and I know you're still hard at work writing stories, and they're always very interesting to read. So,
well, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity.
sure. So here, let me just stop this. Okay.